This is part 3 of the Braver Angels discussion on Kyle Rittenhouse and the Kenosha shootings. I will link the first 2 parts of the video series in the description below. So we're going to go ahead and pick up on this just in case you haven't been following. Braver Angels is a collection of people who get together, and what they try to do is sort of second guess or question their own long-held political beliefs to examine issues more objectively, and I applaud them for their efforts. Some of them claim to be conservative. I don't think they're very conservative, but one thing that is certain, with the exception of one person, they seem to be starting to grow intellectually here as they uncover more and more evidence about what really happened in Kenosha that night. Hello out there. I am trying to get through.
With his powerful brainwaves cradled in the warmth of reasoning, it's time for Johnnie Walker Dread to straighten you out on a thing or two. Emanating all the way from exciting Las Vegas, Oklahoma, it's the Johnnie Walker Dread Show.
Okay, and away we go.
Susan.
Just a brief comment about the AR guns. When I for a living, I design weapon sights for the Army, including weapon sights for long guns like AR-15s and even more serious weapons, like serious weaponry. The AR, I don't mean to segue into a different subject, but
then don't.
That weapon does not. I come from the right. I'm libertarian. I'm very libertarian and pro-gun rights. But the AR-15 has no business in the hands of a kid like that, none whatsoever, nor in the hands of anybody that I know personally, none.
Well, you're entitled to your opinion. I disagree. I'm sure that people in the comment section will have a lot to say about that. And by the way, I just want to make sure we are clear here. Libertarian is not necessarily right. And I mean by that, politically right. Okay? You can be a heavy leftist and be a libertarian.
Anybody else? May I make a comment in relation to what Carrie said, which is here we are scrutinizing Kyle Rittenhouse's life. Why aren't we scrutinizing George Floyd's life or Breonna Taylor's life or Tamir Rice's life? And to me, it's because there's so obvious who was in the wrong. There's no 2 points of view. The cops were in the wrong. But here, I mean, what would you say to try to put any blame at all on Tamir Rice? I couldn't think of anything. So what's to scrutinize?
I think there's things to scrutinize in terms of whether Tamir Rice made some mistakes, and he did. And this is not to say that there is something wrong with him or he did something bad, but he did make a tragic mistake, and that is there was an orange plug on the toy gun he had. He pulled it off, and I get that he wants to play with the gun, and it's more realistic if it doesn't have the orange plug on it, and so it's more fun to play without the orange plug. I get it. He's a young kid, but he did make that mistake, okay? And we can examine these things. With George Floyd, the fact that he ingested fentanyl is at least a question to consider in court. And therefore, yes, it is a good idea to go ahead and look into his background when it comes to something that's relevant to the proceedings. So I don't agree with this idea somehow that, well, you don't want to look into George Floyd's past because it's so obvious that the cop was in the wrong. It's not so obvious. It went to trial. And therefore, the defense had their own testimony and their own view on things.
He was flat out murdered. But this Kyle story is somewhat more complex, I think. And from my standpoint, anyway, that's why it's worth scrutinizing, because it's so easy to just say he's a bad guy or he's a good guy, depending on your political perspective. But Tamir Rice, George Floyd, what's the other? There's only one point of view that makes any sense, and that is that they were done in by the cops. You know what I mean?
Well, and again, this is vastly oversimplifying. The example is with Tamir Rice. The only view that you can have is that Tamir Rice was done in by the cops. Well, no, I mean, there are some issues here. The police pulled up. They probably made a mistake in getting too close to him. But Tamir Rice pulled a gun on them. As far as they could tell, it was a gun. And they may have overreacted and shot when he didn't have to. It's hard to say. We need to put ourselves in their shoes to really understand, and none of us can do that. So it's not so clear cut that they just drove up and decided, hey, here's Tamir Rice, let's shoot him. It didn't happen that way. They have their own side of the story. Doesn't make them right, but it does make the story a little bit more complicated than she's making it.
Anyway, and Carrie, did you want to make another comment?
Yeah, it was really interesting.
Oh no, here we go again. If you haven't been paying attention, this guy has offered his insight periodically, and he has provided absolutely nothing of value.
Randy, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that what Carrie just said is definitely a reflection of what I understand, and with regard to all of the names that you mentioned, there are people who believe that those cases are not cut and dry, and I have read reasonable arguments, not necessarily that I agree with, but arguments that come from a place of reason that can argue as such. But even beyond those cases, just our viewpoint of what was going on in Kenosha that weekend or that week. So, I mean, there's compilations of all of the burned out cars and burned out structures, and the city essentially in flames the day before, and it's essentially based on the news sources that we surround ourselves with. That if you come from one perspective and that perspective is constantly being reinforced, you would absolutely believe that Kenosha was a complete war zone that weekend, and I could totally understand why you would believe that, and I think it's a reasonable belief, and so when Kyle says I'm here to provide medical assistance, I think it's totally understandable that he says, but I'm carrying my gun because I could get hurt, because I could be in a dangerous situation, and I think he fully believed that, and I think that it is understandable that he believed that, because he was seeing certain things. So I think there's just so many things that we can say that about, that our narrow perspective does not encompass what a lot of other people see.
Thank you, Randy. That's, I guess, the whole point of this discussion, isn't it? Yeah. Wendy, you had something you wanted to say, and that I think that'll be our last question for this segment.
Yeah, thanks. I was just thinking about the way it was the Kyle Rittenhouse thing was reported. I didn't look into it, deeply, but I certainly, I wasn't. I mean, I was reading it in my local town paper, or maybe on some, New York Times breaking news update or something. I feel like it was certainly presented in a very non-nuanced way, as if he had just gone in. I mean, this is my impression, was that he just went in there wantonly shooting people. That was the impression I came away with. And I will say that it did not really occur to me to look into it any more deeply. And I really have to hand it to you, Randy, that you did, because this is very enlightening. I mean, we have to be careful what we read. We can't just take it at face value, even if we're reading it in a, like a, what seems like a mainstream news source.
Wow, she nails it. She nails it. She said, when I first heard about this, it was not presented in a non-nuanced way. The media presented this as a very easy event to analyze. Kid shows up at protest, armed with rifle, opens fire on protesters. That's how it was presented. And keep in mind, a lot of people who first heard that bought into it, and they won't let it go. No amount of evidence is going to change their mind, because they locked into that, built up a real serious hatred for Kyle Rittenhouse, and they just can't let that go. And so trying to convince them by showing them the evidence, showing them what happened, the video footage, the laws, the statutes, is not going to work. They are completely impervious to logic and reason at this point.
Great. Thank you, Wendy. I guess it's time to move on to the next segment.
Indeed it is.
4.
And I actually want to go back to Jojo Rosenbaum. So this is from an earlier part of the essay. But refusing to look at the negative aspects of a victim is not the same as impartially weighing the circumstances of the violence. When trying to piece together what happened that night and evaluate Rittenhouse's self-defense claim, evidence of what Rosenbaum did in his final moments is key. We don't know yet, and may never know, what he did. But we do know that earlier in the night, he belligerently confronted armed militia members, daring them to shoot him. And we watched that earlier. But let's take a look at some other aspects of Rosenbaum's story. So what I realized after watching this was that I was too busy offloading blame from Kyle for his poor choices. I forgot to extend the same courtesy to Jojo. In an earlier draft of the article, after seeing his shoot me video, but before I knew anything about him, I had written that Rosenbaum needed better friends who would stop him from being such an asshole. But I was wrong. We failed Jojo. He needed us, and we utterly abandoned him. He was a sexual abuse victim who became an abuser and a bully. He was angry, depressed, and probably scared, especially that day when he was pushed out of the mental hospital and then told by his fiancée that he had to go out on the street rather than be seen around her because of the legal consequences. We literally put a mentally ill person on the street and then told him he had to stay away from the only person he knew that he loved. I was angry with harsh judgment at the person who made the decision to put him back out on the street, and then I realized that they're working within the constraints of a system, and that system has failed because we can't trust each other anymore, and so we can't get anything done to help people like this. But you know who else the system failed? Kyle Rittenhouse. He was bullied out of high school and ended up doing online homeschooling. And he encountered a bully who himself was a victim, and that pain exploded all over the streets of Kenosha. Our hatred and distrust for one another created both of these situations, which brought these men together that night. So, my questions. Does the real blame for this whole incident lie with a broken system? And how much blame can we lay at our own feet for our inability to put our differences aside to help those in need?
Carrie, go ahead.
I think this is the reason why Braver Angels exists. It is so that we can say, I'm not 100% at fault, but the part that I am at fault, I will take. And because I have fault, I have the ability to change. So I'm going to work to make things better. That things are awful and people are struggling, but that I have some influence and power, and where I choose to put it needs to be where there's problems. And I think this sheds light on some pretty important problems. We're talking about Kyle Rittenhouse, but it seems like it's trivial since there's probably thousands and thousands of other Kyle Rittenhouses that are ready to explode.
There are thousands and thousands of other Kyle Rittenhouses ready to explode. Wow. Okay. Yeah, he's really opened up his mind to understand all the nuances in this. Jeez. One of the things I should notice is that he didn't say that there are thousands of Jojo Rosenbaums out there ready to explode. It was Jojo that exploded. It wasn't Kyle. Kyle ran. Jojo was the one that just simply could not control his mental rage. And yet he trains his comments on Kyle. All right.
and that we can do stuff to prevent it. We can do stuff to make people's lives better. And that the mission of Braver Angels to be able to listen to one another is a requirement. We can't just say, I know I have the solution, you're bad, I'm right, and I'm going to force this solution on you. The solution has to come from all sides because it's going to take the work of all sides. And I think it's going to take humility and courage to try to make a dent in this problem. But I think it's worthwhile.
Thank you, Carrie. I see that we're getting close to closing time, and we have one more segment to do. So let's just take one more comment from Gordon, and then we'll move on to the next segment.
I don't think the system is broken. I think it's imperfect. It reflects society and it reflects who we are. Locking up people with mental problems has difficulties in that we take away rights that we extend to everyone else. We reallocate money for, I think, foolish purposes, but it's very difficult to get any money in the public system to be reallocated. So I don't think that something is broken. I think that our collective system of welfare is simply a reflection of the imperfection of humans who make up that society.
In another video, I talk about the foster care system. In my opinion, that is broken. There is an alternative, and that's the orphanage. If we went back and rethought what orphanages should be like, I think that there's a solution to many of our problems there. Unfortunately, politicians get in the way, and last time that somebody tried to bring that idea up, that was Newt Gingrich. A certain person by the name of Hillary Rodham Clinton shot it down by making allusions to David Copperfield. I have never liked her ever since.
Thank you, Gordon. Randy, should we move on to section 5?
Happy to. So each of us, from progressives to pro-Trump conservatives, must come to terms with the fact that the other side's belief in our side's compliance and complacence with the rise of fascism is sincere, and that this is a problem. Indeed, that very polarization is how fascism wins, by convincing everyone involved that each provocation from their opponents must be met with equal force, lest they be emboldened. But we can break that cycle by choosing to judge with more humanity the actions of those who oppose us, to see them as the flawed human that they, and we, are. This is not to draw false equivalence. Each of our tribes has made no secret that they abhor that. And I have no doubt about which side of the debate I'm on. But believing in one's own righteousness does not require demonization of those who you see as committing unjust acts. Some progressives argue that oppressors should be denounced and exposed as violent monsters. They argue that this was the should be denounced who you see as committing unjust acts. Some progressives argue that oppressors should be denounced and exposed as violent monsters. They argue that this was the strategy of Dr. King's nonviolent resistance to win over the moderate middle. But I think this misses the point of King's philosophy, and that is of his intellectual forebears. They stood firm in the face of violence and made it very visible to the public, so society was able to look upon itself. Their words were important too, but those words didn't tear others down. They called them up to join the beloved community, to invite even their oppressors to join in that community when it is realized. This philosophy hinges on a universal potential for redemption, which I see as a core component of humanity. To call someone an evil monster based on the reaction to a provocation is to not only deny their humanity, but to further assert that because of the difference in our DNA, that we are incapable of the sins of our enemies. But human behavior is a product of experience and circumstances, more so, I believe, than genetics, and leaning on the concept of evil to explain it denies our own potential for extreme acts of good or bad. This is the most classic of cognitive distortions. as we're so fiercely protective of our self-images. But believing ourselves immune from humankind's most acute fallibility is the quickest path to our own fall. What does this mean for our outreach to those who we see as fallen? For myself, to truly live the principles of the philosophy of King and his ilk, to truly behave as though I believe in the possibility of redemption for all, means that there is no line for me, no ideological distance I will refuse to bridge. And I just wanted to add a note about the concept of evil. As a relevant side note, Kyle is reported to have seen, for myself, truly live the principles of the philosophy of King and his ilk, to truly behave as though I believe in the possibility of redemption for all, means that there is no line for me, no ideological distance I will refuse to bridge. And I just wanted to add a note about the concept of evil. As a relevant side note, Kyle is reported to have seen people rioting on TV the night before and called them monsters. My involvement with Braver Angels has reinforced for me that regardless of the distance, I will always believe in the value of reaching out to someone, of trying to understand them. I would have that conversation with an open mind to their perspective, with no expectation of changing their mind about their actions, regardless of how deep their sin. So here is the discussion question. Am I right? Is it always worth reaching out to someone?
That's some beautiful commentary. I wished I had played that to Logical Checkmate and V Radio before our meeting we had last weekend. That would have tied in perfectly with what we were talking about.
Marietta, I see your hand up.
Sure. Randy, I have a thought about this, and it has to do with victims, people who are manipulated, and people who intentionally manipulate others for their own personal gain. I know it's extremely difficult and perhaps impossible to look at someone's motives and incentives, but if perhaps it was really evident that someone was specifically manipulating people who are vulnerable, people who are easily influenced for their own monetary gain or for the purpose of gaining power, influence, and other things. Do you consider it worthwhile to reach out to someone like that, knowing, well, anticipating perhaps that they might simply try to deny it, but that their actions and words and other circumstances would point to that is their actual purpose?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that. I think there's always a chain of causation. So when we look at Jojo Rosenbaum, for example, should he be excused for being a quote unquote child molester? Well, I mean, I think we have to look at the fact that he was molested himself as a child. And so that doesn't mean that I would excuse his behavior and or condone it, obviously, but it does mean that I would reach out to him and try to understand his experience. And I think that's entirely relevant. And I cannot think of a person on earth in history, and this is me personally, right? So, but I would always want to hear someone's story, someone's experiences that led them down a very dark road.
Chip.
Thank you. That's a great question. Is it always worth reaching out? I guess we all have to decide that for ourselves. I just want to say I admire all of you for wanting to reach out and to have a big open minds, which is, I find personally very hard to keep an open mind as much as I would like to. So anyway, you all are inspiring.
Thank you. Carrie, Diana, let's get Vicky first. No, Carrie first, and then Diana, you're raising your personal hand because you can't raise your Zoom hand. Okay, Carrie, let's go.
Okay. Yeah, I think that anyone can be a Braver Angels, but not everyone is one yet. I think that some people aren't ready to talk, and that when they're not, we should respect that, and that our energy should be focused on people who are ready to talk, because it's already pretty hard to do. And I've tried to talk to people who were not ready to talk, and it doesn't work out very well for anybody. So I think it takes patience. Don't give up on anybody, but I think it's okay to say today, maybe not.
He's probably the hardest one to convince of anybody there. He's probably the most hard-headed one. And here he is talking about, well, not everybody is willing to talk and willing to accept a sort of counter viewpoint. Well, what he is saying is not everybody is willing to accept his viewpoint. You don't see him changing his mind on anything.
Diana, you wanted to say something. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
I have been heavily involved in the mental health field because of personal life experience and also current volunteer experience and employment. And it's been my lifelong conclusion that almost all of us, if not all of us, are always trying to do the best we can all of the time. And that's true across the board, no matter whether you're the manipulator, the perpetrator, the victim, whatever. And I think that trying to reach across and understand what's going on, that's the bigger person who can do that. And we all have somewhat of a responsibility to be the one that demonstrates that we are trying to reach out. And if we have that capacity and we're able to do it, then I think we have a responsibility to do it. Not all of us have that capacity. And so if we do, I think we're kind of acting in the place of all those who can't. Thank you.
One thing I notice is that all of this talk about reaching out, understanding the other person's perspective, understanding their background and how they got there only began when he brought up Jojo Rosenbaum. They weren't doing this with Kyle. But all of a sudden, when you bring up Jojo Rosenbaum and his insanity, everything changes. And all of a sudden, now we have to think about, well, now, yeah, he was kind of nuts, but there are reasons for that. He was doing the best he could, given what we gave him, and the system failed him. Okay.
Thank you, Diana.
And Susan, I did want to also point out that I believe I saw Sheila trying to raise her hand.
So we have three blue hands and Sheila's personal hand.
Okay.
Sheila, you haven't said anything, so why don't you go next? Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay. As far as talking to others with whom we disagree, I think all of us could profit by learning how to listen.
Thank you. Vicki, go ahead and unmute yourself.
I found this very powerful, and it's brought up a lot of thoughts I hadn't had on the first reading of this. I want to extend the idea of reaching out to that of the punishment that's going to happen. I don't know anything about what's happened so far in the case, but I'm assured probably that Kyle will go to prison.
Yeah, let's not go too far with that one yet. Let's not go too far with that yet.
And we know that the American penal system puts people away and they punish, and they don't try to give people the support, the psychological support to reconstruct their lives so that
she still thinks that Kyle Rittenhouse is nuts, that he's got a mental health problem. She can't get off that.
They can become bona fide members of society again. And I think we should really rethink our penal system and try to make it more humane so that people aren't just put away for life, and that we show the possibility of grace and forgiveness even to the hardest of criminals.
If I'm in prison for life, I'm not sure I care whether you forgive me at that point. What good does that do me?
I think it's really hard to do that. And I sometimes think of the phrase, fake it until you make it. Just try to do it, and maybe eventually we will all feel that in our hearts. Thanks.
So she really thinks that Kyle, well, he's just guilty. And what we should do is work hard to try to forgive him for being chased by Joseph Rosenbaum and being chased by that mob.
Thank you. Susan, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes. Oh, Vicki, that was powerful what you just said, and I agree wholeheartedly. And I also think, as far as always reaching out and finding empathy for people, I also want to try to find empathy for some of the police officers who have been involved in some of these awful incidences and what they're going through. And I think that what brought them to that place is many times brushed over, ignored, and they are just held up as a demon incarnate. And I would like to extend some empathy to them and to understand what they have been through. And I just want to put in a plug for another podcast that's along the lines of Randy's wonderful article, and that's Malcolm Gladwell's podcast. It's an episode called Descend into Particulars. Again, Malcolm Gladwell, Descend into Particulars, and it talks about the Ferguson incident. And as you know, he delves in a very deep way, as Randy did, and it really opens my mind to what happened there. It's much more complex, and I felt empathy on all sides, as Randy's article has made me feel in this case. Yeah, that's
Thank you,
it.
Susan. The name of that podcast, if you don't know, is Revisionist History, Malcolm Gladwell's podcast.
Yes.
So yeah, it's wonderful. Randy, did you want to make some final comments? We have a couple more hands, but I thought you might want to say some sort of.
Yeah, I do. I do have a couple final comments, so I will end with that.
Shall we take them? I'll take these two questions.
Yeah, I think it's not long for my comments, so I do want everyone to be able to say their.
Great, Barbara, go ahead and unmute yourself. You're muted, Barbara.
Maybe the I actually have a question for Randy, so you can defer your answer until your final comments. But first, I wanted to thank you for giving us more insight into this set of events than was available and easily available in the media. What was it that led you to look into this more deeply than probably any of the other of us on this call? I was just curious about that. There is something probably that touched you, or that prompted some more deeper insight, because you showed us some things that I had not seen before. But you can wait until your final comments and maybe go with the other question first.
No, that's okay. I mean, it's a great question, and I'm trying to see if I have a screenshot that I took of some of the headlines here. This is it. Let me try to share this right now, because I thought that this was really representative of how this story was presented when it first kind of hit the airwaves. So we see juxtaposed two Google search results, Google video search results, and the murder charges against Kyle Rittenhouse are a joke. So unequivocally, right? He's a perfect self-defense case. And then Trump refuses to condemn the Kenosha shooter, which implies that he obviously should, right? That he is, that this case is ripe for condemnation. And this is exactly how I saw the story being presented. And beyond that, there was so much video evidence out, right? and I guess maybe in retrospect, I would think, why weren't all these like serious journalists looking at all this video evidence, and how could they possibly come to a conclusion that this was unequivocally this or that? And I think that's probably what drove me to evidence. And how could they possibly come to a conclusion that this was unequivocally this or that? And I think that's probably what drove me to really look that deeply into this.
And he makes a good point. Talks about how could journalists have come to these really odd conclusions here. Keep in mind, mainstream media has really dropped the ball in the whole Kyle Rittenhouse shootings. In fact, mainstream media has dropped the ball over the last decade. A lot of the truth that we now know wasn't uncovered by seasoned journalists with their bachelor's degrees and things like that. It was covered by independent dudes who were on their own, just digging and digging and digging. It's pretty sad when the land of journalism has to depend on unprofessionals, amateurs, to do their work for them.
Deborah, go ahead and unmute yourself, and I guess this will be our last question.
Yeah, I just, as far as reaching out, I feel, well, I'm kind of still new at this. I'm learning a lot. I have my training wheels on. But I feel like there's certain groups of people, for instance, the young men that marched in Charlottesville with those torches, it totally freaked me out. And really, I feel fear when I even think about them. And I don't feel much empathy for them, but I do have a curiosity about how did this happen? How did they get to become aligned with a white supremacist group? And I think they actually identify as that. I'm not categorizing that. I'm pretty sure they see themselves as white supremacists. Maybe I'm wrong. But I'm just curious, Randy, would you speak to somebody like those men in Charlottesville?
I'm going to go ahead and step away from the microphone here and go ahead and let this play out. There's another few minutes left, and so I'll be back to put in some final commentary.
Unequivocally, absolutely. And
have you?
I have not. No, I guess I haven't really been presented with the opportunity. But what I would say is something that I say sometimes, which is tough for some people to hear, is that. So I come from a Jewish background, and so obviously the events of World War II, the Holocaust, are very personal to me, and at the same time, I do believe that I would sit down with Adolf Hitler and listen to him. I actually have a copy of Mein Kampf on my bookshelf, and I've tried to read it. I couldn't quite get through it because, well, for various reasons, but I don't see listening to someone as being the same as condoning anything that they've done. And I think it's incredibly important that we try to understand people and how they've gotten to that dark place, because when people call Hitler an evil monster, I think it does disservice to what we could possibly learn, to how someone could have a life story that drives them to such horrific acts, but he was still a human being. He was fully human, and I think we really need to understand that deeply. And so that's why I would sit down, and I don't expect everyone to have the same answer that I do, right? I think it's perfectly understandable. I also see myself as relatively at the apex of privilege, right? I am a straight white male. I am protected from a lot of the negative impacts of many people's words and even actions. And so I see it kind of as incumbent upon myself to put myself in that situation and have those conversations. And if I can make a connection with someone and learn from them, and thereby put them in a posture to be a little bit more open to learn from me, and I can actually make a positive impact on the world in that way, then I think that is part of my responsibility. So yeah, that's why my answer is yes to whoever you would name. Yes, I would.
You're the reason they changed the name from Better Angels to Braver Angels. You're brave. All right, thank you.
I appreciate that. So I do want to close out with some final words. I would like to read the last sentence of my piece, but I did add on a little bit to it, and so I want to mention that. So I ended the piece by saying, "Let us all make this promise to see the best in one another instead of assuming the worst, lest we help to fulfill our own dark prophecies." And beyond that, I want to say that this I think is a bit reflective of some of the things that came up earlier. This incident, to me, is both everything wrong with our country and everything right about our country rolled into one. We know all the wrong already. But what about the right? Of when citizens see their community being destroyed and they band together to stop it. And the right of when other citizens see an armed gunman who has just shot someone and they rush toward danger to confront him and remove his gun so he can't hurt anyone else. That's the kind of courage that we applaud during school shootings. Can we see the good in two people who met in a deadly altercation while also seeing the circumstances that led them to that moment and our responsibility to do something about it? Can we spur ourselves to action to confront the sources of our pain without the specter of a villain to blame? And with that, I really thank everyone for coming and engaging in this great conversation. This has been really rewarding for me, and I hope that it's been rewarding for you as well. Thanks.
Randy, thank you so much for all the work you put into this. It's just been extraordinary from the beginning to end. Thank you very much.
And thanks for all the support from everyone who helped to put this together. By the way, I also want to mention a shout out to Mari, who put together the webpage with all the embedded video, and of course to Phil and Gordon, who organized this and got all the invites out and all that stuff. I mean, this has been a real group effort. So thank you to everyone.
Thank you. I think we'll close it there rather than go on and ask for reactions, because it's already a quarter of an hour late. Time for supper. But everybody, thank you so much for coming and joining in on this. It was just wonderful. Couldn't have been better. So good night and thank you.
Well, there you have it. You have about 12 people there. I never did count them, but I think there was about 12. And you're going to have 12 jury members. So my question to you is, if this was Kyle's jury, what do you think would happen? Do you see a conviction here? Do you think all 12 would be willing to go ahead and say guilty, knowing full well that the penalties for a conviction are severe? 60 years in prison, maybe even a life in prison. Do you think they would pull the switch? Do you see an acquittal? Do you think that you could convince all 12 of these people to say not guilty? Now, of course, this is all assuming that they would see the evidence, right, unfold in front of them. They wouldn't be able to ignore it. And they would have to be appraised of the actual law. Not that they can't ignore the law and go ahead and acquit or convict based on their own feelings, but you can make them listen to it. How many of these people do you think, as it stands, based on where they are right now, is within easy reach of an acquittal? How many do you think are within easy reach of a conviction? Like my video, subscribe to my channel.